think. The notion that humans always act primarily with their intellect leads them away from answering the question, what are the most fundamental mechanisms in the brain that enable human thought? Because humans are always initially driven by their emotional goals, just as it was at the time of the first life, which arose from matter and wanted to survive. This method, the process, has been preserved to this day. The intellect, which emerged later, has the task of examining the questions in a more nuanced way. This means, it is not primarily the intellect that guides humans, but their feelings. The reversal of this statement is based solely on the goal of hubris, to distinguish humans from other living beings, which are controlled by feelings, and thereby to buy the freedom of will. There is overlooking and searching thinking. While the former is more of a scanning process, the latter deals intensively, cognitively, with goals within oneself. Then there is also the ancient behavioral pattern, similar to a pecking bird taking in its surroundings in order to be able to react quickly to danger. This can stimulate midpoints in the human brain, leading to increased attention, and through the midpoint mechanics influence the psyche. Unintentional thinking can trigger new topics and potentially activate midpoints that distract from the current task. Mindfulness exercises and meditation can help counter the onslaught of constant mental chatter. Generally, this continuous checking is useful. However, it can also become excessive. Cognitive thinking is an interplay between general attention or consciousness, increased perception of information, and the mind in the brain, with regard to a goal, a question or a topic. Thinking always involves an impulse that triggers concentration on a topic, a goal, and then prompts the brain, its vast organic networks, to generate ideas in response to the questions posed. For within itself lies everything a person carries within him, both inherited and experienced, in whatever form. This intensifies awareness, sensory perception. As a result, the mind is strengthened to gather information on this topic. This activates neural networks, midpoints, prompting the mind to search for experiences or similarities related to the topic. Results that come particularly close to the goal are brought to conscious awareness through heightened attention and direct the mind in that direction. This process of thinking, midpoints, awareness, midpoints, continues until one has a coherent feeling, reaches a point of no further progress, or is superseded by another topic. The brain compares and offers alternatives. It makes suggestions, anticipates them, and foresees results. Consciousness experiences these and relays the information back to the brain. This is the process of thinking. And by the way, concentrated thinking is always conscious, it is perceived. Why is it so difficult for most people to truly accept that their brain, which, of course, includes the ego with its goals and will, controls them? Answer: because their feelings tell them something different, namely, that the ego determines everything with its will. Feelings are control mechanisms that can have a great deal of power and persuasive force over people. Their feelings tell them that they control themselves with their consciousness, because that is the experience of feelings and is not questioned. Rational explanations such as, the brain decides everything, or there is no free will, generally have virtually no influence. Because this would limit the pleasant feeling of freedom. However, if someone does happen to question whether this feeling is correct, that they have free will to decide with their ego, or rather, their consciousness, then the brain will still say, yes. Because there are often quick and not thoroughly considered answers. It is simply too much effort for the brain to engage the prefrontal cortex more intensely and thus try to confirm or refute this feeling. Added to this is perhaps the fear that one actually lacks free will, and that the notion of deciding solely with one's metaphysical consciousness is nothing more than a figment of the imagination. Therefore, if one wants to get to the bottom of thinking, the brain, specifically the frontal lobe, must engage with it in detail. This is achieved very effectively through self-observation. So, let's recap the process in detail. One wants to know something, for example, a solution to a problem, how to realize an idea, why something happened, etc. This creates a goal. This activates the brain, which searches the neural networks, the midpoints, for what might be relevant. It makes suggestions or decides. If this isn't enough, the process continues. What has been found becomes more or less conscious. For example, through perception, images, diagrams, designs, or feelings. This means that information, both external and internal, is received through heightened senses, which consciousness then reflects back to the brain. The brain can then create a modified response, potentially accepting or rejecting these solutions and continuing its search. This process usually continues until one feels that the question one wanted to answer has been sufficiently addressed. A note on consciousness: anyone who believes that humans decide all of this through their consciousness would have to explain where the information that consciousness needs to make decisions comes from. And they will inevitably have to admit that it originates in the brain. Consequently, consciousness would also have to have access to the brain and determine what is correct for the decision. This would be a very time-consuming task each time because the amount of information in the brain is enormous. Consciousness would have to control the entire brain, everything one has learned, everything one has inherited, everything that has changed in the meantime, and so on. And the consciousness of this kind would then have to select, compile, and create a solution based on the decision. This type of consciousness cannot be found anywhere, let alone proven. Summary of the steps: a question arises. Where does it come from? From the brain, and specifically, from a goal that is to be achieved, to answer the question. Impulses from the outside world also first pass through the brain. Whenever a question arises, the brain first provides an answer, never conscious awareness. Even if the ego were to provide the answer, it would still originate in the brain, because the ego, with its goals, resides there. When something is important, it becomes conscious. Consciousness, with heightened senses, receives information for the brain. Then further questions may arise. This back and forth continues until the brain has decided that the goal has been more or less achieved. This decision is usually also made consciously. As a result, the person believes that they themselves, with their conscious awareness, made this decision. Most people prefer making decisions based on feeling rather than thinking, because it's easier and far less strenuous. But this doesn't lead to greater clarity, because too little time is given to cognition. Finally, a comment on Descartes' statement: I think, therefore I am. I would add, I am because, among other things, I think. Thinking is greatly influenced by feelings. These developed at the beginning of all life to provide a framework for survival. The rule is, what has proven positive in the past, for example, in carrying out a task, is applied in the present to solve similar situations. This very simple approach can solve problems without much thought. However, it is often lacking because there are many situations that differ significantly. My question to AI, artificial intelligence, in February 2026. What is the process of thinking? And what role do emotions play in it? Answer: here is a clear and concise version, a script. It is written in a way that makes it easy to speak without sacrificing scientific precision. How thinking works, and why emotions are indispensable. Intro: when we say, I'm thinking, it sounds as if thinking is a purely rational process. In reality, it is an interplay of perception, memory, evaluation, and above all, emotions. Without emotions, we could not think meaningfully. Let's look at why that is. 1. Perception, the starting point of every thought. It all begins with our brain taking in stimuli, sounds, images, memories, bodily sensations. But we never perceive everything. Our brain filters immediately, and this filter is strongly influenced by emotions. Fear makes us attentive. Joy broadens our focus. Stress narrows it. 2. Pattern recognition, the unconscious sorting. Before we consciously think, our brain works in the background. It searches for patterns. What does this remind me of? Have I experienced this before? This is where the meaning of a stimulus arises, even before we realize we are thinking. 3. Conscious thinking, what we experience as thinking. Now the prefrontal cortex kicks in. It compares options, plans, analyzes, and weighs things up. This is the part we call rational, but it is slow and energy intensive, and it needs emotional signals to set priorities. 4. Decision making, often faster than we think. In the end, the brain chooses an option. Interestingly, many decisions are made unconsciously before we consciously perceive them. Our conscious mind then explains them afterward. Why feelings are essential for thinking. 1. Feelings direct attention. Without emotions, everything would be equally important. Feelings tell us, look here, or ignore that. 2. Feelings provide value signals. The brain needs an evaluation, good for me, bad for me. This evaluation comes from the limbic system. Without it, we couldn't make decisions. 3. Feelings shape our memory. Emotional events are stored more strongly. And when thinking, the brain preferentially retrieves emotional memories. This influences how we solve problems. 4. Feelings are fast heuristics. Our gut feeling isn't magic, but rather condensed experience. It's often faster and more precise than conscious analysis. 5. Feelings can distort thinking, but also improve it. Too much fear, tunnel vision, slight arousal, better performance, good mood, more creativity. It's not about switching off feelings, but about understanding them. Conclusion: thinking is not a cold, logical process. It is an interplay of perception, memory, analysis, and emotion. Feelings are not the enemy of reason. They are its foundation.